The stale air in my father's study tasted of dust and finality. His funeral was a masterclass in performative grief, my mother clinging to my brother's arm like a shipwreck survivor. Now, they were gone. It was just me, my fiancé Liam, and the hulking iron safe behind the desk. My father's lawyer had handed me the key with a look of pity and intrigue. Liam squeezed my shoulder, his voice a low anchor in the quiet. "You don't have to do this now," he murmured. I shook my head, my fingers tracing the cold brass dial. I had to. A deep gut feeling told me this box wasn't just holding stocks or bonds. It was holding an answer, and that answer would change absolutely everything. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. My family always operated on an unspoken set of rules, a constitution of dysfunction written in invisible ink. Rule number 1. Daniel, my older brother, was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets orbiting his glorious, and often catastrophic, needs. Rule number 2. Mom was the keeper of the narrative, the public relations expert who spun Daniel's failures into charming misadventures and my successes into dull, expected certainties. Rule number 3, and this was the most important one. I, Clara, was the designated adult, the fixer, the emotional janitor. My job was to show up with a metaphorical mop and bucket every time Daniel decided to light another part of his life on fire. For 30 years, I played my part beautifully. I was the reliable one, the responsible daughter, the one who never asked for too much. I kept the peace. That's what Mom always said, her voice dripping with the syrupy praise she reserved for when I was doing exactly what she wanted. "Oh, Clara, you're just so good at keeping the peace." What she meant was, "You're so good at swallowing your own needs so Daniel doesn't have a tantrum." I was the designated driver at a demolition derby, and I was expected to smile and say the ride was lovely. My father, he was the silent chairman of the board. He'd watch the chaos unfold with a kind of weary resignation, occasionally stepping in to write a check, which was his solution for everything. A failed business venture for Daniel? Check. A totaled car? Check. A last-minute trip to Europe to find himself after another dramatic breakup? Check, check, check. Meanwhile, I had put myself through college, paid off my student loans, and built a career from scratch. My achievements were met with a polite nod, like I'd successfully remembered to buy milk. This was the landscape of my life, a carefully constructed diorama of familial sacrifice, and I was the load-bearing wall holding the whole flimsy thing up. It wasn't until Liam came into my life that I started to see the cracks in the facade. He was an outsider, an observer who hadn't been indoctrinated into the family cult. He saw the inequity with fresh eyes, and he wasn't afraid to call it out. The first time he witnessed the dynamic in person was at a family dinner. Daniel announced he was quitting his perfectly good job to become a freelance artisan, specializing in handcrafted birdhouses that looked suspiciously like rejected middle school woodshop projects. He needed a few $1,000s for startup costs. I watched my dad pull out his checkbook without a moment's hesitation. Later that night, Liam asked the question that would begin the unraveling. He asked, "Do they ever do anything like that for you?" I laughed it off, reciting the family line. "Oh, I've never needed it. I'm the responsible one." Liam didn't smile. He just looked at me, his expression serious. "Needing it shouldn't be the prerequisite for receiving support, Clara." That one sentence was a bomb. A quiet bomb, but a bomb nonetheless. It detonated 20 years of my carefully rationalized acceptance of the family hierarchy. It was the first time anyone had suggested that the system wasn't just the way things were, but that the system itself was fundamentally wrong. And it was the first inkling I had that my father, the silent, benevolent banker, might be hiding more than just his checkbook. The birdhouse incident was a small tremor, but the earthquake that truly shook the foundations came about a year before my father's diagnosis. Daniel, in his infinite wisdom, had decided to invest in cryptocurrency, based on the advice of a guy he met in a bar. It went about as well as you'd expect. He didn't just lose his own money, he lost a significant amount of money he had borrowed from our parents without telling them the full story. The fallout was nuclear. Mom went into full crisis mode, which for her involved a lot of dramatic sighing and making pronouncements about how Daniel was just too trusting, too pure for this cruel world. My father was quiet, his face a grim mask of disappointment. They called a family meeting, which was code for, "Clara needs to come over and help us figure this out." I walked into the lion's den, expecting to be asked for a loan, or at the very least, a detailed plan on how to consolidate Daniel's new mountain of debt. But the request was far more insidious. They wanted me to co-sign a loan for him. My mother presented the idea as if it were a brilliant, collaborative solution. "It would just be a formality, sweetie," she said, her hands fluttering nervously. "Your credit is so wonderful, with your name on it. The bank won't ask any questions. It's the only way to get your brother back on his feet." I looked at Daniel. He was slouched on the couch, staring at his phone, the picture of a man utterly unconcerned with the wreckage he'd created. He couldn't even be bothered to participate in his own financial rescue. I looked at my father, expecting him to intervene, to say this was a line too far. He just sat in his armchair, staring into the middle distance, silent. The silence was his consent. Liam had warned me about this. He'd said, "They've used up their own resources on him, and now they're coming for yours. This is what happens when you enable an addict, and Daniel is addicted to being rescued." I said no. It was a small word, but it felt like pushing a boulder uphill. The reaction was instantaneous and vicious. My mother's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't believe you're being so selfish, Clara, after everything we've done for you." "Done for me?" I wanted to scream. I had never been given a car, a down payment, or a bailout. I had been given the responsibility of being the family's emotional shock absorber. Daniel finally looked up from his phone. "Wow, Clara, I see how it is. You finally get a little bit of success, and you forget where you came from." This was their classic move, the gaslighting two-step. First, attack with manufactured hurt, then pivot to accusations of betrayal. It was designed to trigger my guilt, my lifelong conditioning to be the peacemaker. But this time, bolstered by 100 quiet conversations with Liam, I held my ground. I told them I loved them, but I would not put my financial future at risk. I would not be the safety net for Daniel's chronic irresponsibility. The meeting ended with my mother sobbing that I was tearing the family apart. My father escorted me to the door, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something, to offer a word of support. He just placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and said, "Your mother is very upset. You should call her tomorrow and smooth things over." He still didn't get it. He saw the problem not as Daniel's behavior, but as my refusal to enable it. I was the one disrupting the system, and therefore I was the one who had to fix it. I didn't call my mother. That refusal was the beginning of a cold war that lasted until the day my father got sick. His illness came on suddenly, a thief in the night that stole his strength and his voice. A series of strokes left him weakened, reliant on others for everything. And just like that, the family's unspoken rules snapped back into place. Daniel was, of course, too emotional to handle the grim realities of caregiving. He lived only 20 minutes away, but his visits were brief and theatrical. He'd breeze in, pat Dad's hand, tell a loud, unfunny joke, and then announce he had a very important meeting to get to. He was performing the role of the devoted son for an audience of one, himself. My mother, meanwhile, fell apart in a way that was both genuine and strategically useless. She was overwhelmed by grief, which manifested as an inability to schedule appointments, manage medications, or have a difficult conversation with a doctor. Her entire existence became a whirlwind of panicked phone calls to me at all hours of the day and night. "The hospice nurse is coming. What do I say to her?" "The pharmacy gave us the wrong pills, I'm sure of it. Can you come and look?" "Your father is making a funny noise. You need to get over here right now." So, once again, I became the designated adult. I took a leave of absence from my job. I organized the medication schedules. I dealt with the insurance companies. I sat through the long, draining meetings with neurologists and therapists. I learned how to operate a feeding tube and how to help a once proud man with the most basic, undignified tasks. Liam was my rock. He would come over after his own long day at work, cook dinner, and just sit with me, holding my hand while I vented or cried. He never once said, "I told you so." He just listened, and he'd ask quiet, pointed questions. "Where was Daniel today? Did your mum remember to order the supplies?" He saw exactly what was happening. I was being parentified all over again, forced to manage not only my dying father, but also my two emotionally adolescent family members. The resentment in me grew, a cold, hard knot in my chest. I was exhausted, grieving for the father I was losing, and furious at the family I was stuck with. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, my father was lucid for a few minutes. He grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. His speech was slurred, but I could make out the words. "The safe," he whispered, his eyes wide with a strange urgency. "Key, in my desk. For you, only you, Clara." I thought he was delirious. I patted his hand and told him to rest. But he shook his head, his gaze insistent. "Promise me," he rasped. To calm him, I promised. I didn't think about it again until after he was gone. My mother and Daniel, of course, had no idea about this conversation. During the final weeks, their focus was on what would happen after. They spoke in hushed tones about the estate, a word that sounded obscene in the quiet of a sick room. They were vultures circling, waiting for the inevitable so they could pick over the remains. When he finally passed, their grief felt hollow, performative. At the funeral, my mother put on a heartbreaking show as the grieving widow, and Daniel was the stoic son, a pillar of strength. I just felt numb. As I stood by the casket, I wasn't thinking about the good times. I was thinking about a promise I'd made, and the insistent, desperate look in a dying man's eyes. I was thinking about a safe. The reading of the will was exactly the kind of carefully orchestrated farce I had come to expect from my family. It took place a week after the funeral in a stuffy, wood-panelled office that smelled of old paper and unresolved disputes. My mother was dressed in black, looking tragically fragile. Daniel sat next to her, patting her hand at regular intervals, a perfect pantomime of filial devotion. Liam was with me, a silent, solid presence at my side. The lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, a man who had known our family for decades, cleared his throat and began. On the surface, it sounded eminently fair. My father had divided his assets equally between his two children. The family home, a beautiful old house with a sprawling garden, was left to me. My mother had the right to live there for the rest of her life, of course, and the will stipulated that the property could not be sold until after her passing. Daniel received my father's investment portfolio, a collection of stocks and bonds of a value roughly equivalent to the estimated value of the house. It was neat, it was tidy. It was a perfectly balanced equation designed to look good on paper, but Liam and I both knew it was a spectacular act of financial gaslighting. I was being handed a responsibility, not an asset. A house I would have to maintain, pay taxes on, and manage for the indefinite future, all for the convenience of my mother, without any ability to access its actual value. Daniel, on the other hand, was being handed a pile of liquid cash. No strings, no responsibilities. He could cash it all in tomorrow and blow it on more artisanal birdhouses or imaginary internet money. My mother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Oh, it's just what your father would have wanted," she whispered. "So fair. He always wanted to be fair." Daniel nodded solemnly. Dad was a good man. I could feel Liam tense beside me. He knew, as I did, that this was the final, posthumous continuation of the family's core dynamic. Daniel gets the freedom. Clara gets the obligation. I was being crowned Queen of Responsibility, and the house was my castle and my prison. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, my face a carefully blank mask. Arguing was pointless. It would only feed their narrative of me being difficult and ungrateful. This was their checkmate, or so they thought. As Mr. Abernathy was shuffling his papers, he paused. "Ah, there is one last item," he said, pulling a small manila envelope from the file. "Robert left this for you, Clara." He slid it across the polished table. My name was written on the front in my father's spidery, weakened handwriting. Inside was a single, old-fashioned skeleton key. My mother peered at it. "What's that?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Just some old personal effects," I said, slipping the envelope into my purse before she could demand a closer look. Daniel snorted. "Probably a key to his secret diary. Hope you like reading about golf scores." They dismissed it, just as I knew they would. To them, the important business was concluded. The money had been divided. They had won. They didn't know about the promise. They didn't know about the safe. And they had no idea that the real will, the one that mattered, wasn't a piece of paper in a lawyer's office. It was a story told by whatever was waiting for me inside that cold iron box. The key in my purse felt heavy, like the weight of 20 years of secrets. Getting my mother and Daniel out of the house after the will reading was a strategic operation. My mother wanted to go through your father's things, which was her code for making sure I didn't find anything she didn't want me to find. She floated through the rooms, picking up trinkets, her voice wavering as she recounted some fabricated, heartwarming memory associated with each one. "Oh, remember this ugly little dish? Your father bought it on our honeymoon. He had such terrible taste, but such a good heart." Daniel, meanwhile, was already talking about his plans for the money. He was going to invest in a disruptive tech startup that sounded like a complete scam. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who has never once faced a real consequence. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his newfound, unearned wealth. I played the part of the dutiful daughter. I made tea. I nodded and smiled. I let them exhaust their own dramatic energy, until finally they were ready to leave. "You'll be all right here on your own, dear?" my mother asked, her hand on my arm, her face a mask of concern. It was a token gesture. She wasn't worried about my grief. She was making sure I was going to continue to be a responsible steward of her future home. "I'll be fine," I said. "I just need some time alone." As soon as their car pulled out of the driveway, the suffocating atmosphere in the house lifted. Liam, who had been patiently waiting in the living room, came into the hall. "Are you ready?" he asked. We walked into my father's study. The room was just as he had left it. Books on military history lined the walls. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on his desk, and the air held the faint scent of his pipe tobacco. And there, in the corner, partially hidden by a heavy velvet curtain, was the safe. It was older than I was, a hulking, dark green monster from another era. I had seen it my whole life, but I'd never given it much thought. I'd always assumed it held boring things like property deeds and insurance papers. My father had been a man of routines and practicality, not secrets. Or so I had thought. I knelt in front of it, the key feeling cold and foreign in my hand. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This felt like a transgression, an invasion of privacy, even though he had explicitly given me permission. What if Daniel was right? What if it was just full of old golf trophies and bank statements from 1985? What if this whole thing, this feeling in my gut, was just wishful thinking? What if I was just desperately searching for some sign that my father had seen the injustice, that he hadn't just been a silent accomplice to my family's toxicity? Liam put a hand on my back, a silent gesture of support. "Whatever's in there, we'll deal with it together," he said. I took a deep breath, inserted the key into the lock, and turned. The click of the tumblers echoed in the silent room, a sound that felt both final and like a beginning. The heavy door swung open with a low groan, releasing a gust of stale, trapped air. And inside, I saw it. It wasn't just papers, it was a meticulously organized archive of a secret life, my father's secret life, and my family's. There were stacks of ledgers, photo albums, and thick, sealed envelopes. And sitting right on top was a letter, addressed to me. "To my Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry. I owe you an apology that is 20 years overdue." My hands trembled as I picked up the letter. The paper was thick and creamy, the kind of expensive stationery my father reserved for important correspondence. His handwriting, usually so firm and decisive, was shaky, a testament to his failing strength in his final days. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold iron of the safe, and began to read. The letter wasn't long, but every word landed like a physical blow. He started by apologizing not for what he did, but for what he failed to do. He wrote that he had seen the dynamic, the imbalance, the way my mother and I had been conditioned to cater to Daniel's every whim and failure. He called it the path of least resistance, a phrase that perfectly encapsulated his passive approach to parenting. He admitted that showering Daniel with money was easier than dealing with the emotional fallout of saying no. It was easier to buy his silence, to fund his fantasies, than to confront the deeply flawed person he and my mother had created. He called it a coward's way out, and in that moment, reading his own self-condemnation, I felt a flicker of something other than resentment. It was a strange, disorienting pity. He wrote that he had started keeping records about 20 years ago, around the time Daniel dropped out of college for the second time, and my father had to pay off his substantial gambling debts. That event, he explained, was a wake-up call. He realized that his son was on a path to self-destruction and that he was the primary architect of that path, but he felt trapped. My mother was fiercely protective, refusing to see any fault in her golden boy. Any attempt on my father's part to instill discipline was met with tears and accusations that he was being cruel. So, he chose a different path. He began to document everything. He became the secret accountant of our family's dysfunction. The letter ended with a simple, chilling instruction. Everything in this safe is for you. It is the truth. What you do with it is your decision. You can close this door and walk away, or you can use it to finally balance the scales. Whatever you choose, know that I finally tried to do the right thing. Forgive me for being too late. Liam read the letter over my shoulder, his arm a solid weight around me. When he finished, he just said, "Wow." It was all that needed to be said. The apology was one thing, but the proof was another. I turned back to the contents of the safe. Beneath the letter were the ledgers. There were 3 of them, thick, leather-bound books filled with my father's precise, methodical script. I opened the first one. The first entry was dated 20 years ago. The item description was brief: to cover D's outstanding debts at university. The amount next to it made me gasp. It was more than my first year's salary out of college. I flipped the page, and another, and another. It was all there, a meticulous, damning record of 2 decades of bailouts. Down payments for apartments he was later evicted from, cars he crashed, failed business, Ventures the t-shirt printing company, the gourmet dog biscuit delivery service, the disastrous foray into day trading. He had recorded every single dollar, every check written, every bill paid. He had even included notes in the margins. D promised this was the last time. M insisted this was crucial for his self-esteem. Loan for art supplies. Suspect it was for a trip to Vegas. It was a secret history of my brother's life, a life subsidized entirely by my parents' silent, enabling bank account, and the numbers were staggering. As I skimmed through the pages, doing a rough calculation in my head, I started to feel sick. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a fortune. It was the inheritance they had told me was being split equally. My half had been siphoned off, year after year, to fund my brother's extended adolescence, and I had been completely in the dark. The ledgers were the financial skeleton of the family's deceit, but the photo albums were its soul. There were 4 of them, thick and heavy, not like the flimsy scrapbooks my mother kept. These were different. The first one I opened wasn't filled with smiling family portraits. The first page had a single, crisp $500 bill taped to it. Beneath it, in my father's handwriting, was a date and a note: Daniel's rent. He told me he was a little short. I later found out he had just returned from a ski trip in Aspen. The next page had a receipt from a high-end jewelry store for a woman's watch. The note read, "A gift for his latest girlfriend, to apologize for a misunderstanding. He borrowed my credit card." It went on like this, a bizarre and horrifying scrapbook of my brother's profligacy. There were pictures of crashed cars next to the repair bills my father had paid. There were brochures for luxury resorts next to credit card statements showing Daniel's extravagant spending. My father had documented it all with the dispassionate precision of an archivist. He was building a case. He was collecting evidence against his own family, against his own weakness. It was a chilling glimpse into the secret life he had been leading, the quiet resentment he must have felt while publicly playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. This wasn't just accounting, it was a cry for help, a message in a bottle that he had buried in an iron safe, hoping one day I would find it. Then I saw a section that made my blood run cold. It was titled, "The College Fund." My parents had always told me that they had only had enough money to set up one college fund, and since Daniel was older, it had gone to him. They told me they had planned to do the same for me, but a series of bad investments had wiped out their savings right before I graduated high school. It was a story I had always accepted without question. It was just bad luck, bad timing. I'd worked 2 jobs all through college to make ends meet, proud of my independence, never realizing that my independence had been born from a lie. In the album, my father had pasted the original bank statement for my college fund. It had been opened the day I was born. And next to it was the withdrawal slip, dated the week Daniel started his 3rd and final, failed attempt at a business degree. The memo line on the slip had one word: tuition. But it wasn't my tuition. He had cashed out my entire college fund to pay for my brother's. He had stolen my future to pay for Daniel's present. I felt a wave of nausea. All those years of eating ramen noodles, of working late shifts at the university library, of feeling a quiet pride in my self-sufficiency, it was all a sham. I wasn't self-sufficient because I was strong. I was self-sufficient because I had no other choice. They had taken my safety net and handed it to my brother, and they had never said a word. They had watched me struggle, and had praised me for my resilience, all while knowing they were the cause of my struggle. The word fair echoed in my mind, my mother's voice at the will reading. He always wanted to be fair. The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost breathtaking. Liam, seeing the look on my face, took the album from my hands. He scanned the page, his expression hardening. "Clara," he said, his voice low and furious. This is unbelievable." But we hadn't even gotten to the worst of it. Tucked in the back of the album was a thick, sealed envelope. On the front, my father had written 2 words: the accident. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the envelope marked, the accident. I had a sinking feeling I knew which accident he was referring to. When Daniel was 21, he was in a car crash. The family story, the one my mother had polished and perfected over the years, was that he had swerved to avoid a deer on a rainy night. He'd hit a tree and totaled his car, but miraculously walked away with just a few scratches. It was another one of Daniel's dramatic scrapes with fate, another story that added to his mythos as the charming rogue who always landed on his feet. He'd been shaken up for weeks, and my parents had coddled him endlessly, buying him a new, even nicer car to help him get over the trauma. I remembered being a teenager at the time, feeling a bit of resentment that he got a brand new sports car out of the deal, but I'd accepted the story. Why wouldn't I? It never occurred to me to question it. I tore the envelope open. Inside wasn't a letter, but a collection of documents. The first was a police report. I scanned the details, the date, the time, the location. It was all correct. But the description of the incident was chillingly different from the family fairy tale. There was no mention of a deer. Instead, the report detailed a second vehicle, a small sedan, that had been run off the road. The driver of the sedan had sustained moderate injuries. The report stated that the driver of the other vehicle, my brother, had fled the scene. A hit and run. My breath caught in my throat. I kept reading. The police had identified Daniel's car from witness descriptions of the make, model, and partial license plate. The next document was a copy of a cashier's check made out to a name I didn't recognize. The amount was astronomical. It was a settlement, a very, very large settlement. There was a legal agreement, drafted by a high-powered lawyer I'd never heard of, a non-disclosure agreement signed by the victim of the hit and run. It was a contract for their silence. My father had paid them off. He had made the whole thing disappear. The final items in the envelope were a series of photographs. They weren't from the police. They looked like they had been taken by a private investigator. They showed the other car, its front end smashed in, resting in a ditch. They showed the victim, a young woman, in a hospital bed, her arm in a cast, and the final photo was of my brother's car, tucked away in a private garage, the front bumper and headlight clearly damaged. My father hadn't just paid for Daniel's legal defense. He had orchestrated a cover-up. He had used his money and his influence to erase his son's crime, to ensure there would be no police record, no criminal charges, no consequences whatsoever. He had bought Daniel a clean slate. This went so far beyond financial irresponsibility. This was a crime. My brother was a criminal, and my parents, my quiet, respectable parents, were his accomplices. They had lied to everyone, including me. They had constructed an elaborate fiction to protect him, to preserve the flawless image of their precious golden child. I thought about Daniel at the funeral, standing tall and looking somber, accepting condolences from friends and family who saw him as the grieving, responsible son. The hypocrisy was a physical thing, a sickness rising in my throat. This whole time, my entire life, I had been living in a carefully curated museum of lies, and my father had just handed me the visitor's guide, complete with a map of every single exhibit. The weight of the secrets in that safe felt physical, like the room was tilting on its axis. Every memory I had of my family was now tainted, refracted through the prism of this new, horrifying truth. I thought of all the times my mother had called Daniel too sensitive or too soft-hearted. It was a lie to cover up the fact that he was reckless and cruel. I thought of all the times my father had sighed and said, "Boys will be boys," writing a check to fix another one of Daniel's messes. It wasn't weary resignation. It was active, criminal enablement. They hadn't just spoiled him. They had systematically dismantled his conscience. They had taught him, with money and with lies, that actions do not have consequences, that responsibility is for other people, for people like me. Liam watched me, his face a mixture of anger and concern. He took the police report from my numb fingers. "Clara, I don't even have words for this. They lied," I whispered. It was all I could manage to say. They lied about everything. We spent the next hour meticulously going through the rest of the safe's contents. It was a treasure trove of deceit. There were copies of Daniel's college transcripts, showing that he hadn't just dropped out, he had been expelled for cheating. There were threatening letters from loan sharks that my father had apparently paid off. There was even a prenuptial agreement from Daniel's first, very brief marriage, an agreement my father had clearly funded to protect the family's assets from the woman my brother had cheated on and discarded. My father had saved every receipt, every document, every piece of evidence. He had built an irrefutable case against the people he was supposed to love the most. The question was why? Why keep all of this? Why document it so carefully, only to hide it away? Was it guilt? Was it his own form of penance, to live with the physical proof of his moral failures? Or was it something else? Was this his final, desperate attempt at justice? He had been too weak in life to stand up to my mother and my brother, too afraid of the conflict, of disrupting the toxic peace he had paid so much to maintain. Maybe this was his only way of fighting back. A posthumous rebellion, a dead man's confession. By giving me the key, he wasn't just giving me information, he was giving me a weapon. He had armed me with the truth, a truth so explosive it could shatter what was left of our family. And he had left the choice of whether or not to detonate it entirely up to me. It was the ultimate act of cowardly empowerment. He couldn't do the right thing when he was alive, so he had outsourced the job to me after his death. He had finally made me the designated adult in the most profound way imaginable. I looked at the piles of paper spread out on the floor, the ledgers, the photos, the legal documents. It was a mountain of evidence. I had two choices. I could, as he suggested in his letter, close the safe, lock it, and throw away the key. I could walk away and let them have their lies and their stolen money. I could try to find some peace in ignorance, pretending I had never learned the truth, or I could burn it all to the ground. I could take this truth and hold them accountable for every single lie, every single dollar, every single crime. For the first time in my life, the path of keeping the peace felt utterly, completely impossible. The peace was a lie anyway. It had been bought and paid for with my future, my trust, and a young woman's silence. For the next 2 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. Liam and I moved the contents of the safe to our own apartment, locking the documents away. I didn't want them in my father's house, a place that now felt like a crime scene. I called my mother and told her I needed some time to process things and that I wouldn't be staying at the house. She was immediately suspicious. "Is everything all right, Clara? You sound strange." Her concern was a finely honed tool designed to extract information. "I'm just tired, Mom," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I felt a strange and unsettling clarity. The grief for my father was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. The man I had mourned was a fiction. The real man was a coward who had documented a lifetime of injustice and then left it for his daughter to clean up. My anger at him was a low, steady burn, but the fury I felt toward my mother and brother was a raging inferno. They had conspired to defraud me, not just of money, but of a true and honest life. They had built their world on a foundation of my unwitting sacrifice. Liam was incredible. He didn't push me or tell me what to do. He just made sure I ate. He held me when I started to shake with rage. He was my anchor, the one solid thing in a world that had become a sea of lies. We spent hours talking, laying out the options. We could hire a lawyer and sue Daniel for the money he had essentially stolen from my half of the inheritance. The ledgers were meticulous. A civil case would be a slam dunk. We could, theoretically, go to the police with the information about the hit and run. The statute of limitations might be an issue, but the cover-up itself, the conspiracy to hide it, might be its own crime. Or I could confront them. I could lay the evidence on the table and watch their world crumble. It was the third option that appealed to my basest instincts. I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to watch the masks of piety and victimhood slip and see the panic underneath. I wanted them to know that I knew. On the third day, I made my decision. I wasn't a law enforcement agency. And I didn't just want the money back. I wanted something more. I wanted a confession, not a spoken one. I knew I'd never get a genuine apology from them. I wanted the confession that comes from the silent, panicked realization that all your lies have been found out. I called my mother. "I need you and Daniel to meet me at the house tomorrow at noon," I said, my voice steady and cold. "There are some things from Dad's estate we need to discuss." "Oh, did you find some more papers?" she asked, a little too casually. "Something like that," I said. "Just be there." The trap was set. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I went to an office supply store and made high-quality color copies of everything. The police report, the settlement check, the photo of the victim in the hospital, the withdrawal slip for my college fund. The most damning pages from the ledgers. I arranged them into 2 neat folders, one for my mother, one for Daniel. I felt a chilling sense of purpose, like an avenging angel preparing for a final judgment. I was no longer Clara, the peacemaker. That person had died the moment I opened the safe. The person who would be waiting for them tomorrow was someone they had never met before, and she was done keeping the peace. I arrived at the house an hour early. The familiar rooms felt alien, charged with a new, menacing energy. I walked into the study and stood before the empty safe, its door still ajar. It looked like an open mouth, a silent witness that had finally disgorged its secrets. I closed and locked it, the click echoing the finality of what I was about to do. I set the stage in the formal dining room, a room we only ever used for holidays. It was a place of forced smiles and simmering resentments, the perfect theatre for the drama I was about to direct. I placed the 2 folders in the center of the long, polished mahogany table, one at my mother's usual seat, one at Daniel's. Liam was with me, not to participate, but to be a witness. His presence was my silent statement that I was no longer alone, no longer susceptible to their united front of manipulation. He stood by the window, arms crossed, a quiet guardian. They arrived exactly at noon, right on time, which was unusual for them, and a sure sign they were nervous. My mother came in first, forcing a bright, brittle smile. "Clara, darling, what's all this mystery about?" She tried to kiss my cheek, but I turned my head slightly so it landed on air. The small, cold rejection threw her off. She faltered for a second, her smile flickering. Daniel followed her in, radiating his usual brand of unearned swagger. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Hey sis, found Dad's secret treasure map?" He laughed, but it was strained. He looked at the folders on the table, then at Liam standing silently by the window, and his bravado seemed to shrink a little. "What's he doing here?" he asked, jerking a thumb toward my fiancé. "Liam is here for support," I said, my voice calm and even. It was a tone they had never heard from me before. It wasn't angry or pleading, it was chillingly neutral. "Please, sit down." They exchanged a look, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. They sat. My mother immediately reached for her folder, but I held up a hand. "Not yet." I sat down opposite them, the table feeling like a vast, empty battlefield. For a long moment, I just looked at them, letting the silence stretch and thicken. I watched my mother's smile twitch and fade, replaced by a tight, anxious line. I watched Daniel's casual slouch slowly stiffen into a more defensive posture. They were used to being in control of the emotional temperature of any room they were in. Now, they had no idea what the weather was. I let the silence do its work, let their carefully constructed composure begin to fray at the edges. Finally, when the tension was so thick I could practically taste it, I spoke. For my entire life, I began, my voice as cold and hard as steel, you have both operated under the assumption that I was blind. That I was the good, dutiful, responsible daughter who would just keep cleaning up the messes and never ask any questions. You were wrong. My mother's hand fluttered to her chest. Clara, I don't know what you mean. We have always been so proud of you. Proud of my ability to absorb the costs of your choices, I countered. Proud of my willingness to be the family's permanent shock absorber. Daniel shifted in his chair. Here we go. Look, Clara, if this is about the money from the will. Oh, this is about the money, I said, leaning forward. It's about all of the money. The money for the cars. The money for the failed businesses. The money for the gambling debts. The money you took from my college fund to pay for Daniel's tuition before he was expelled for cheating. I watched the color drain from their faces. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Daniel looked like he had been slapped. They were stunned. This was information they thought was buried forever. They had no idea I was just getting started. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own steady breathing. My mother stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Daniel had frozen, his hand halfway to a glass of water, his face a mask of disbelief. They looked like criminals caught in a spotlight. How could you possibly know that? My mother finally whispered, her voice a reedy thread. Dad was a very meticulous bookkeeper, I said, gesturing to the folders. He left me the key. You can open those now. They reached for the folders as if they were venomous snakes. My mother's hands trembled as she fumbled with the clasp. Daniel just stared at his, seemingly unable to touch it. She opened hers, and the first thing she saw was the copy of the withdrawal slip, the one that had emptied my college fund. A small, strangled gasp escaped her lips. She looked up at me, her face a canvas of desperation. There was a reason for that, Clara, she started, her voice regaining a little of its familiar, placating tone. Your brother was in a difficult place. We were trying to help him build his confidence. You stole from me to build his confidence? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You decided that his feelings were more important than my future. You watched me work myself to the bone for 4 years, knowing that you had taken the money my father had set aside for me, and you said nothing. You praised my work ethic. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it is almost admirable. I turned my gaze to Daniel, who still hadn't opened his folder. Open it, Daniel. He flinched at the command in my voice. Slowly, he opened the cover. The first page I had put in his folder was the police report from the hit and run. His eyes scanned the page, and I watched the last vestiges of his bravado crumble into dust. He looked small, pathetic. This isn't real, he mumbled, shaking his head. This is some kind of fake document. Is it? I slid a photograph across the table, the one of the young woman in the hospital bed. Does she look fake to you? Her name is Sarah. She was a nursing student. She had to drop out of school for a semester because of her injuries. The ones you gave her when you ran her off the road and left her in a ditch. My mother let out a sob, burying her face in her hands. We didn't know what else to do. He would have gone to jail. His life would have been ruined. So you ruined someone else's instead? I shot back. And you bought her silence. You created a fiction about a deer on a rainy night, and you told it so many times you probably started to believe it yourselves. But Dad didn't forget, did he? He remembered. And he kept the receipts. I let that hang in the air. I had them. The ledgers, the reports, the photographs. It was an airtight case, and they knew it. The power dynamic in the room, the one that had governed my entire life, had been irrevocably shattered. I was no longer the pleading child asking for scraps of fairness. I was the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury, and they were finally, for the first time in their lives, in the dock. Daniel looked from the report to me, his eyes filled with a desperate, cornered animal fear. The mask was gone. The charming, irresponsible rogue had vanished, replaced by a weak, terrified man. And in that moment, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a vast, empty pity for him. My parents had done this to him. They had loved him so much that they had destroyed him. My mother was the first to rally, her instincts for self-preservation kicking in. She dropped the victim act and switched to offense, her voice rising with indignant fury. I cannot believe you are doing this to us, Clara. At a time like this, your father is barely cold in his grave and you're here making these horrible accusations. You're tearing this family apart. It was their signature move, the ultimate gaslighting maneuver. Accuse the person holding you accountable of being the one causing the problem. For years it had worked on me. The fear of being the one who tore the family apart was the cage that had kept me compliant. Not anymore. This family was torn apart a long time ago, I said, my voice unwavering. It was torn apart every time you wrote a check to cover up a crime. It was torn apart every time you lied to my face. It was torn apart when you stole my college fund. I'm not the one holding the grenade here. I'm just pulling the pin on the one you planted 20 years ago. You're the ones who built this house on a foundation of lies. I'm just pointing out the cracks. I turned to Daniel. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Any of it? For any of the lies, the theft, the crime you let our father cover up for you? He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at my mother, a silent plea for her to save him, to spin a new story, to make it all go away. But she had nothing. I had taken away her tools. Her narrative was useless against a stack of hard evidence. It wasn't like that, Daniel finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Dad, he wanted to help, he offered. He offered to help you cover up a hit and run? I asked incredulously. He offered to let you steal from your own sister? You are a 35-year-old man, Daniel. When does it end? When do you finally take responsibility for a single thing in your entire life? He had no answer. He just stared at the damning papers in front of him, his shoulders slumped in defeat. This was the real Daniel, stripped of the protective armor my parents had built around him. He was nothing. A hollow man, a collection of appetites and excuses. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I'm not going to sit here and listen to this. This is a betrayal. Your father would be ashamed of you. No, I said, standing to face her. He was ashamed of himself. That's what this is all about. This safe, these documents. This was his confession. This was his apology to me. He was too much of a coward to do it while he was alive, so he left the evidence for me to find. He knew what you were. He knew what Daniel was. And he documented it for 20 years. So don't you dare tell me he would be ashamed of me. He was ashamed of you. The truth of the words hit her like a physical force. She recoiled, her face pale. She had lost. She had no more moves to make, no more lies to tell. There was nothing left but the ugly, undeniable truth laid bare on the dining room table. The battle was over. Now, it was time to dictate the terms of surrender. I let the silence hang for another long moment, allowing the full weight of their defeat to settle on them. My mother sank back into her chair, looking deflated and old. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed on a spot on the mahogany table. The righteous indignation was gone, replaced by the grim, quiet reality of their exposure. So, here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Liam shifted his weight by the window, a subtle reminder that I was not alone in this. The will, as it was read, is a fraud. It was predicated on the lie that my father's assets were being split equally. But as we now know, my half of the inheritance was given to Daniel over the last 20 years. The ledgers prove it. I paused, letting that sink in. I have consulted with an attorney. I have more than enough evidence to take Daniel to civil court and sue him for the full amount he received, plus interest. Based on my father's meticulous records, that amount is roughly $1.2 million. That's not even counting the settlement for the hit and run, which I could argue was also taken from joint marital assets that should have been part of the final estate. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. 1.2 million? That's crazy. The portfolio Dad left me isn't even worth that much now. That sounds like a personal problem, I said, feeling not a shred of sympathy. Perhaps you shouldn't have invested in that disruptive tech startup, but I'm willing to be reasonable. My mother looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. She still thought she could appeal to the old Clara, the one who always smoothed things over. What do you want, Clara? She asked, her voice quiet. First, Daniel is going to turn over the entire investment portfolio that Dad left him. Every last stock, every last bond. It will be liquidated, and the money will be transferred to me. That will be considered a partial repayment of the debt he owes me. But that's everything, Daniel protested. That's my inheritance. You got your inheritance in advance. I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. You got it every time you crashed a car, failed a business, or committed a crime. This is the reckoning. That portfolio is mine. I turned to my mother. Second, you will be selling this house. You have 90 days. You will move into a smaller, more manageable condominium. A portion of the proceeds from the sale will go to establishing a trust for your long-term care, so that I don't have to worry about it. The rest of the proceeds will also be transferred to me, as further repayment of Daniel's debt. Sell my home? She whispered, horrified. Clara, I've lived here for 40 years. And for 20 of those years, you lived here while you enabled a thief and a criminal and lied to your daughter's face, I said coldly. Consider this an eviction. You no longer have the right to live in the house that my stolen future paid for. The finality in my tone left no doubt that I meant every word. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a list of demands. Demands backed by a mountain of evidence that could ruin them both, legally and socially. I had all the power, and for the first time in my life, I was going to use it. The final demand was the one that mattered most to me, more than the house, more than the money. It was about peace, my peace. And third, I said, looking from my mother's devastated face to my brother's terrified one. After the accounts are settled and the house is sold, we are done. The two of you will no longer be a part of my life. I want no phone calls, no emails, no surprise visits on my birthday. I am officially resigning from my position as the designated adult of this family. You will not meet my future children. You will not be a part of my future in any way. We are finished. This is the price of my silence. My mother started to weep, not the performative sobs I was used to, but the ragged, ugly crying of genuine despair. Clara, you can't mean that. We're family. No, I said, the word feeling more true than anything I had ever said. We are not a family. A family doesn't steal from one of their own to protect the other. A family doesn't build its entire existence on a foundation of lies and deceit. What we were was a dysfunctional business arrangement where I provided all the emotional labor and you and Daniel reaped all the benefits. The business is now dissolved. Daniel, finally finding his voice, tried a different tactic. Bargaining. Okay, Clara, okay. The money, the house, fine. You can have it. But cutting us off completely? Isn't that a little extreme? We can fix this. We can go to therapy. I almost laughed. The absurdity of it was staggering. He was suggesting we fix a 20-year conspiracy with a few one-hour sessions with a therapist. Therapy is for people who want to change, Daniel. You don't want to change. You just want this to go away so you can go back to the way things were. There is no fixing this. You can't fix a bullet hole with a bandage. You broke my trust. You broke my heart. There's nothing left to fix. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I will have my lawyer draw up the necessary paperwork to transfer the assets. I expect your full and immediate cooperation. If I encounter even the slightest resistance, if you drag your feet or try to hide a single dollar, I will file the civil suit the next day. And I will also make an anonymous phone call to the district attorney's office regarding a certain hit and run from 15 years ago. I'm sure they have cold case detectives who would find that file very, very interesting. Am I making myself clear? My mother nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Daniel just stared at me, his face a mixture of hatred and fear. He finally understood. I wasn't bluffing. He had lost, completely and utterly. I walked out of the room without a backward glance. Liam met me in the hallway, his expression unreadable. He just opened his arms, and I walked into them, the rigid control I had maintained for the last hour finally cracking. I didn't cry. I just shuddered, a long, deep tremor that shook my entire body. It was the feeling of a lifetime of weight finally being lifted from my shoulders. It was over, the war was over, and I had won. The 90 days that followed were a masterclass in grudging compliance. My mother and Daniel knew I held all the cards, and for the first time they were genuinely afraid of me. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Davis, was ruthless and efficient. She had the paperwork drawn up within a week. Daniel signed over the investment portfolio with a hand that shook with barely concealed rage. The look he gave me when he handed me the pen was one of pure venom. He hated me not just for taking his money, but for taking his power, for exposing him for the fraud he was. The portfolio had indeed taken a hit, thanks to his disruptive tech investment, but the bulk of it was still there. Seeing the balance in my own account, money I had technically earned through years of unwitting sacrifice, felt less like a victory and more like a sad, sterile reimbursement. It was blood money, tainted by decades of lies. The house was the bigger battle. My mother dragged her feet at every turn. She complained that the real estate agent I hired was too aggressive. She insisted on being present for every showing, where she would follow potential buyers around, pointing out fictional flaws and regaling them with long, tearful stories about the memories she had made in every room. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt at sabotage. I had to have Miss Davis send her a formal letter threatening legal action to get her to stop. She finally found a small condo on the other side of town, a place she described as a shoebox and a hovel, despite it being a perfectly lovely two-bedroom apartment. The day the house sale closed was surreal. I stood in the empty living room, the walls bare, the floors echoing with every footstep. This house, the backdrop to my entire life, was no longer mine. It was no longer a prison. It was just a building, a collection of wood and nails that held no power over me anymore. After the legal fees, the money for my mother's trust, and all other expenses were settled, the remaining proceeds were wired to my account. The number was substantial. It was enough to pay off my mortgage, max out my retirement accounts, and still have a significant nest egg for the future. It was the financial security my parents had stolen from me, returned in one lump sum. On the final day, my mother had to be out of the house by 5 p.m. I went over at 5:15 to do a final walkthrough with the new owner's agent. My mother's car was gone. When I walked inside, I found she had left one thing behind. On the mantelpiece in the living room was a single, framed photograph of me as a child, smiling gap-toothed at the camera. It was a final, desperate plea, a pathetic attempt to remind me that we had once been a family, that she was still my mother. I picked up the frame, looked at the happy, ignorant little girl in the photo, and felt a profound wave of sadness for her. Then I took the picture out, tore it into 4 pieces, and dropped it into the empty fireplace. I left the frame on the mantel, a final, silent message. The past was gone. There was nothing left to salvage. Life after the schism was strange at first. The silence was the most noticeable thing. For years, my phone had been a source of constant, low-grade anxiety, a conduit for my family's endless stream of demands and manufactured crises. A call from my mother meant she needed emotional support. A text from Daniel was inevitably the prelude to a request for money or a favor. Now, my phone was just a phone. It buzzed with messages from friends, with work emails, with funny pictures from Liam. The constant, thrumming bass line of familial obligation was gone, and the quiet it left behind was glorious. It was the sound of freedom. I didn't realize how much space they had taken up in my head until they were gone. I had more energy. I was sleeping better. The knot of resentment that had lived in my chest for so long had finally started to dissolve. I felt lighter. Liam and I started planning our wedding, something that had been on the back burner during the chaos of my father's illness and the subsequent fallout. Planning it was a joy, unburdened by my mother's inevitable criticisms or Daniel's attempts to make the event all about him. We could pick the venue we wanted, invite the people we loved, and design a day that was a true reflection of us, without having to manage anyone else's expectations or egos. It was a revelation. About a month after the house was sold, I got a call from an unknown number. It was my aunt, my mother's sister. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity got the better of me. She sounded distraught. "Clara, I don't know what you did to your mother, but you need to fix it. She's a wreck. She calls me every day, crying. She says you've abandoned her." I listened patiently as she relayed the heavily edited, victim-centric version of the story my mother had undoubtedly fed her. In that version, I was a cruel, greedy monster who had kicked her poor, grieving mother out of her home and stolen her inheritance out of pure spite. There was, of course, no mention of my college fund, the ledgers, or the hit and run. "I understand you're upset, Aunt Carol," I said when she finally wound down. "But you have only heard one side of a very complicated story. My mother and my brother made some choices over the last 20 years, and now they are living with the consequences of those choices. This is not my fault, and I will not be fixing it. But she's your mother, she insisted, as if that one fact negated everything else. That is a biological fact, yes, I replied. But it is not a blank check for a lifetime of manipulation and deceit. I wish her well, but I will not have her in my life. The same goes for Daniel. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. She, like everyone else in my extended family, was used to the old Clara, the one who would do anything to avoid conflict. They didn't know how to deal with this new version. I ended the call politely but firmly, and then I blocked her number. It was a small act, but it felt significant. I was building a wall. Not a wall to keep the world out, but a wall to protect the peaceful, honest life Liam and I were building. A life where family was defined by love and respect, not by obligation and lies. The first holiday season was the hardest. Christmas had always been a command performance at my parents' house, a day of forced cheer and carefully navigated emotional minefields. I would spend a fortune on thoughtful gifts for everyone, only to receive a generic gift card or a regifted candle from Daniel. My mother would spend the day sighing about how much work it all was, while I did most of the cooking and all of the cleaning. I'd always left feeling exhausted and empty. This year, the thought of the holidays filled me with a strange mix of relief and melancholy. I was free from the obligation, but the absence of the tradition, however toxic, left a void. Liam, as always, understood. He suggested we start our own traditions. We decided to spend Christmas Eve volunteering at a local soup kitchen. Serving meals to people who were genuinely grateful, who looked you in the eye and said thank you, was a powerful antidote to the transactional nature of my family's version of love. It felt meaningful in a way my old Christmases never had. On Christmas morning, we stayed in our pajamas, drank hot chocolate, and exchanged gifts. It was quiet, peaceful, and perfect. Later that day, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo of my mother and Daniel. They were sitting in her new condo, a small, sad-looking Christmas tree in the corner. They were both holding mugs and attempting to smile for the camera, but their eyes looked hollow. The message underneath just said, "We miss you." It was a pathetic attempt at emotional blackmail, a carefully staged photo designed to prick my conscience and make me feel guilty for my absence. I looked at the photo, at these two people who had caused me so much pain, and I felt nothing. The guilt I had been conditioned to feel my entire life was gone. All I saw were two architects of their own misery, sitting in the lonely world they had built for themselves. I showed the photo to Liam. He looked at it, then looked at me. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I'm okay," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was true. "I'm really okay." I deleted the message and blocked the number without a second thought. That small act felt more final than selling the house, more final than the legal papers. It was me, closing the door for good. I was choosing my own peace. I was choosing the family I was building with Liam, a family based on truth, not on secrets. I was choosing to be happy. As we sat by our own brightly lit tree, I thought about my father. I wondered if this was what he had wanted. Had he hoped I would take the money and the evidence and build a new life for myself? Or was this all just the act of a guilty man trying to clear his conscience from beyond the grave? I realized, in that moment, that it didn't matter. His motives were his own. What mattered was what I had done with the choice he gave me. He had given me the truth, and the truth had, quite literally, set me free. It was the only real inheritance he had ever given me, and it was the only one that truly mattered. A year passed. A year of quiet, uncomplicated peace. Liam and I got married in a small ceremony, in a beautiful botanical garden, surrounded by a handful of close friends who had supported us through the entire ordeal. There was no family drama, no passive-aggressive comments about the flower arrangements, no drunken speeches from my brother. It was just a day filled with love and laughter. It was perfect. I used a portion of the money from the house to start my own consulting business, something I had dreamed of for years, but had never felt financially secure enough to attempt. Being my own boss was liberating. I worked hard, but it was on my own terms, for my own benefit. The success I achieved felt entirely my own, untainted by the long shadow of my family's dysfunction. Every now and then I would hear things through the grapevine. I learned from a cousin that Daniel's disruptive tech startup had predictably, imploded, and he had been forced to take a menial job to make ends meet. Without the safety net of my father's money, he was finally facing the unvarnished reality of his own incompetence. I heard that my mother had become something of a recluse, rarely leaving her condo and complaining to anyone who would listen about her ungrateful, monstrous daughter. I felt no satisfaction in their misery, but I also felt no guilt. Their lives were the direct result of their own actions. I had simply removed myself from the equation. The biggest surprise came in the mail one day. It was a letter addressed to me in an unfamiliar, spidery handwriting. It was from Sarah, the woman my brother had hit all those years ago. I have no idea how she found my new address. Perhaps my father had kept tabs on her. The letter was short. She wrote that she had heard about my father's passing and wanted to offer her condolences. She said that a few years after the accident, my father had reached out to her. He had apologized profusely for what his son had done and for the way the situation had been handled. He had set up an anonymous trust that had paid for the rest of her nursing school tuition and helped her get back on her feet. She was now a head nurse at a major hospital and had a family of her own. She wrote, "Your father was a complicated man. He made a terrible mistake in trying to protect his son, but I believe in his own way, he tried to atone for it. He told me once that he had a daughter who was stronger and more decent than anyone he knew, and that he hoped one day she would understand. I think I finally do." Reading her letter, I finally understood the last piece of the puzzle. My father's actions weren't just about guilt or a cowardly form of justice for me. They were about a deeper, more profound sense of atonement. He had wronged this woman, and he had tried, in his own flawed way, to make it right. He had paid for her silence, yes, but he had also paid for her future. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it made him human. It made the story more complicated than just heroes and villains. It was a story about a weak man who had spent a lifetime making the wrong choices, but who had, at the very end, tried to leave behind a map that could lead to the right ones. Today, my life is unrecognizable from what it was 2 years ago. The anger has faded, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of peace. Liam and I are expecting our first child, a daughter. I think about the kind of family I want to build for her, the kind of mother I want to be. I will teach her that love is not about sacrifice, but about mutual respect. I will teach her that accountability is not a punishment, but a gift. I will teach her that she never, ever has to set herself on fire to keep someone else warm. I will give her a life free from the kind of secrets and lies that defined my own childhood. The safe in my father's study held more than just ledgers and legal documents. It held my liberation. It contained the proof that I wasn't crazy, that the unfairness I had felt my whole life was real. It was the ultimate validation. My father's final act was to give me the truth, and with it, the permission to save myself. It was a strange and complicated inheritance, born of cowardice and regret, but it was the most valuable gift I have ever received. I no longer think of him with anger. I think of him with a kind of sad, complicated pity. He lived his life trapped in a prison of his own making, too weak to break free. But in the end, he left me the key to my own. I never heard from my mother or brother again after I blocked their numbers. As far as I'm concerned, they ceased to exist on the day I walked out of that dining room. I gave them a choice: cooperate and fade away, or face the consequences and be exposed. They chose to fade away. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. The money has given me and my new family a level of security I never could have imagined. But the real prize was the freedom, the quiet, the ability to wake up in the morning and not have my first thought be about what crisis I would have to manage for them today. I severed a part of myself to survive, and I have never once regretted it. The silence they left behind is the most beautiful sound in the world, so I leave it to you. Was I too harsh? Did I go too far by taking the house and the money and cutting them out of my life completely, or was it the only way to finally break a cycle that had been strangling me for 30 years? Let me know what you think.